shifting to our next topic, one that seems completely from out of left field, because we've had our evolution bucket, and we've had our neuro bucket and our ethology, but we've had all of our buckets there, and we are now entering our final bucket before embarking on the second half of the course. This bucket that's kind of in a completely different category than all the others, because it is applicable to how you think about all those buckets. As follows. Okay, let's start off with some pretentious European history. Year 410, Rome falls to the Visigoths or the Vandals or whoever did them. Rome falls. We enter 1,000 years of like incredible dark, murky ignorance in Europe, the Dark Ages, and it is hard to appreciate just how devastating that was, the fall of Rome, for like people having any insight into how the world worked in Europe for centuries afterward. The levels of ignorance were astonishing. There were no books. There was no shared knowledge. There was just this vague sense that, ooh, once in the past, in our golden era, we knew all sorts of stuff. We knew how to fly to Neptune. We knew how to cure cancer. We knew how to be teleporting ourselves. Oh, let's make Dark Age Europe great again. Go back. Just the sense of like all sorts of knowledge had been lost. People were just ignorant as hell. Nobody knew how to read. And that gave rise to terms we use today. You go into a court for a hearing because it's all auditory, because nobody can read. The IRS comes for you and they do an audit. They ask you about stuff back to that time because nobody can read. It was all oral tradition. Nobody wrote down anything. That sort of stuff. Levels of ignorance. Your average peasant living in some Dark Ages hamlet in the middle of Western Europe, according to the historian Barbara Tuchman, estimated once that your average individual there traveled a maximum of 12 miles in their lifetime from their place of birth. Provincialism like crazy. You go 50 miles away from this village and the people there have some dialect that's barely understandable between them. Little isolate, no shared knowledge, no anything. There was no Western European language at the time that had a word for something like ambition, that had a word for concepts like progress, things of that sort. And people were just like unbelievably ignorant about how the world works and logic and cause and effect and all of that. And you would be faced, for example, with, a challenge. Somebody's murdered. So you leap into action to figure out what's going on, and the way you figure it out is somebody or other says, "Oh, that person, that's the leper or Roma or Jew did it. They did it." And how do you find out now if they did it? You throw them in a lake, and if they sink to the bottom, that proves that they were guilty. Or you burn them at the stake, and if you see a Satan come out of their burning throat, then you know they were actually guilty. That's how you figure out stuff. That's how you understand how the world works. And then it all changed dramatically in the year 1085, which was when Christian forces conquered the Moorish, the Muslim principality, county, whatever, in Spain of Toledo. Toledo, Spain, not Toledo, Ohio. Christians, this was the first time that they managed to conquer any Islamic holdings in Spain, and that was the start of all sorts of changes in the geopolitical landscape. And for the purposes of us, the significant consequence of European Christendom conquering Toledo was Toledo had a library. Toledo, podunk Toledo out there in terms of the Ottomans and the Moors and all the entire Islamic world of scholarship and knowledge and stuff, Toledo was like way out in the boondocks. Toledo had a library. And by best estimates, this little out in the boondocks library in Islamic Europe had more books in it than all of Western European Christendom put together, because most of that knowledge had been lost. And best estimates are that the library in Toledo had 60,000 volumes of books at the time, and the biggest, bestest library in Christian Europe, which was either in the Sorbonne or in Avignon, had like 2,000 books. There were a bunch of crazy Irish monks who would manage not to get done in by Vikings and stuff that were hiding manuscripts up there. But the level of like just sheer utter ignorance that was transformed by Western Europe suddenly getting access to a library with all sorts of knowledge about the past. And this was revolutionary. This was the means by which Christian Europe began to learn about all those philosophers back when, and logicians and mathematicians, and this was transformative, and suddenly people were learning about things like cause and effect, and suddenly all sorts of approaches started being useful. Ooh, someone has murdered somebody, and we want to find out. And you know what? A much better way than throwing them in a lake and them sinking to the bottom. Go ask people. See if there were any witnesses. Ask them what they saw. This is a way to find out what happened. Logic, cause and effect syllogism. Suddenly, you were able to generalize from one type of observation to more general versions of it that you could extrapolate into things you don't even know about yet. Whoa, this was totally amazing, transformative, and in lots of ways, this was summarizing this dawning of like westernized thought, ironically stated, in Western Christendom. This was best stated about a century after that. Thomas Aquinas came up with 3 rules of what God can't do. And the first 2 are just like theological in nature, and like God cannot sin. And the other one, God can't make a boulder that's too heavy for him to lift. And thus implicit in that, God could never go to a movie and be surprised by the twist ending at it, because God knows already. God could never get an entertaining evening off at the movies. So the first 2 were sort of theologically stated ways of the limitations on God. The third one that Aquinas said overturned all of European thinking when you took it to the logical conclusion, which was even God cannot make a triangle consisting of more than 180 degrees. Whoa. This was the clearest statement of, when it comes to science and the physical universe and its laws and math and geometry and all of that, and theology, science and knowledge wins. Even God cannot make a triangle which is 181 degrees. And from that moment on a certain level, rationality fueled by science and enlightenment and all of that forever after would have won. And this was greatly summarized by the Dalai Lama, who has said, there's going to inevitably be times where science and religion have contradictory interpretations of how things work. And he himself said, science is going to be right most of the time. He himself, who has said that, well, if he hadn't gotten handed this like Dalai Lama gig, he would like to have been an engineer or a neuroscientist. And he spends a lot of time gathering neuroscientists around him to teach him about the nature of the brain. Aquinas, logic, books, history, logical inferences, all sorts of stuff. And that even opened the way for the most incredible sort of things, which is now there's a murder, and you go and you ask people, what happened? Did you see what happened? And there's a huge problem that would have stopped people in their tracks, which is nobody saw the entire event. Oh my God, this is hopeless. We could never find out. And then this like triumphant moment of logic. There's this person who saw parts A, B, and C. And this other person who saw C, D, and E, and this other one who saw E, F, and G. Oh my God, nobody saw the whole thing. Oh, you can add the observations together and figure out what happened. This was incredibly important breakthrough, and this began to pave the way for what's the single most important concept in science in like the last 1,000 years or so, the notion of reductionism. Reductionism. If you want to understand something complicated, you don't find out by burning the person at the stake and seeing if Satan comes out of their nostrils. You don't come out, you break the complicated thing into its component parts. If you want to understand something complicated, break it into its building blocks and study the individual building blocks to understand how the whole system is working. This was wonderful. This was great. If you happen to get Guy stymied there and gummed up because he still didn't understand this component part, break it into its component parts. And if need be, break those further down and until you understand what's going on with component parts and just add all the pieces back together and you understand the system. And this was wonderful. This was wonderful for things like what happens if a clock breaks. A clock, those things, they used to have gears and they ticked and gear stuff and all of that. So you're sitting there in the Renaissance and somebody's clock is broken and you got a choice. What can you do? Can you try to diagnose it by burning it and seeing if Satan comes out of the gears? Or, oh, now I know why it didn't work. You take a reductive approach. You take the clock apart, you break it down to its separate gears, and then you find, oh, here's the one gear where one of the teeth there is chipped, and as a result, this slips and that comes up and it doesn't work, and let's replace that one piece and add them all back together, and you've got a clock that runs. That's totally wonderful. How do you understand clocks that have stopped running? You take a reductive approach. You understand its component parts. You find the little itty piece that doesn't work, fix that, and put everything back together again, and you should be hunky-dory and ready to go. And we do that reductive approach big time in our own time period. Ooh, about 4 years ago, there was an incredibly demanding question which demanded a reductive approach. How in hell does the COVID virus get into lung cells? And people had to do over there, take apart the virus and study this part and that part and this genes. And oh, here's the coat protein. Here's the critical coat protein that binds to this receptor on lung cells and is able to hijack this or that and that. Ooh, a reductive approach. Whoa, how are you going to figure out what's going on with COVID? Well, we got two options. We can do this reductive stuff and identify a coat protein and begin to develop antibodies to it and get a vaccine. Or you could sacrifice a goat and fling its innards around ritualistically afterward in the hopes that the gods will appease the COVID virus. And reductionism is wonderful. Reductionism has accounted for all sorts of advances, not to mention at the top of it our life expectancy. So what are the key parts of a reductive approach? Point for point relationship. If you understand this one single point in this complicated thing, this one gear in this watch, and you understand this point and this point, and you put all those points together, and you will have knowledge about the workings of the whole thing. What is implicit in that is as follows. If you know the starting state of a reductive system, and you've learned something about how the different components interact, if you know the starting state, you can accurately predict what the entire system is going to be like. And conversely, if it is understood enough at the reductive level, you could look at an entire complex system and understand what the component parts were and how they interacted with each other to make this. Understand this, you know what's happening here. Understand this, you know how you got there. Predictability in that sense. And that could be seen in sort of your ability to extrapolate. Okay, so we have the completely radical equation here of x equals 100. So you are then given the next version, x plus 1, and you sit there and you consult with the wise people and you cogitate on it and you reflect, and eventually you figure out, ooh, x plus 1 equals 101. And then they say, okay, how about x plus 3? And you say 103, and you have just done something that is flabbergasting from the standpoint of where knowledge has gotten to in the last 1,000 years. You had the answer to x plus 1, and then you came up with the answer to x plus 3, and you didn't have to first figure out what x plus 2 was going to be. You didn't have to do the intervening steps. Instead, you could extrapolate. You could extrapolate, and now, knowing this, you know everything. You know that x plus whatever equals 100 plus whatever. X plus a gazillion, x plus a capybara equals 100 plus a capybara. You even could know something like not just x plus a gazillion equals 100 plus a gazillion, but x plus sort of a gazillion will give you 100 plus sort of a gazillion. Ooh, the degree of uncertainty on this side of the equation is directly parallel with the degree of uncertainty you get out of that end. Not only can you extrapolate into the future about things you didn't know before, never before had anyone known that x plus 3 equals 103, and they sure as hell never knew it in a way where they didn't have to figure out x plus 2 first. Not only that, but you could know the parameters of your ignorance by knowing how much noise and uncertainty there was in a starting state. You would know exactly how much there would be. There was a point-for-point relationship between stuff on either side of these equations, including uncertainty, ambiguity, and all of that. So that was absolutely spectacular, and hooray for reductionism. And that is a whole lot better that we have vaccines now instead of, goat intestines explaining stuff. Reductionism will tell you, is this a point mutation or a deletion mutation? Reductionism will tell you whether it's the red dot on the gull's beak that makes the chicks peck at it, or whether it's the curve of the beak. Reductionist approaches and tell you a whole lot, but what our next topic is about is, nonetheless, there are strong limits to reductionism. There are strong realms where you don't figure out what's wrong by breaking something into its component parts. Here's the metaphor. Okay, a clock is broken, you take the pieces apart and you figure it out and you put it back together. Hooray for reductionism. You got a cloud that doesn't rain because of who knows what throughout or whatever. You don't figure out what's going on by dividing the cloud in half and study the two halves. And if you figure those out, put it back together, and you now know how to make clouds rain. And if you don't understand, break each half into half and study a quarter and break those all into their little component parts. And eventually you find the gear in the cloud that has a broken tooth, and you fix that and clouds rain again. No, you don't figure out why clouds don't rain with a reductive approach. You sure can figure out why a watch has stopped working with reductionism, but you can't do that for things like clouds. And the point of this whole next section is, when it comes to the really interesting stuff in us and our behaviors and all of that, we are much more like clouds than we are like watches. Which is to say that the type of cloud machines that we are understandable on a level that doesn't involve reductionism. So there's at least two revolutions that are pertinent to it. And the first one is the one that I sort of have you guys reading that chapter from that book of mine about chaos, chaoticism, and you want to summarize all of that, but please don't go with the summary. Please read the chapter. What you see is chaos is this upending of one of the basic tenets of reductionism, which is, okay, you're a scientist and you want to measure the effects of A on B. So you give A to a whole bunch of subjects and you measure how much B in everyone happens, and you get an average answer. Everybody does not show the exact same levels of B. There's variation. There's variation, and what every good reductive scientist on Earth has been trained to do is look at that and say, oh crap, there's something noisy in the system. The measurement tools we have are not great. We need to get a better, bigger, meaner microscope to look at stuff more closely. All of that, the notion that variability is just noise. Variability is, oh, because I changed my socks this morning and I wore different socks than yesterday, and that's why today's subjects are averaging out to 100.1 and yesterday's subjects were averaging to 100.2. Oh, there's just like noise screwing up our ability to see what's really going on. And what you'll see is the main punchline of chaoticism is that variability is not noise that you want to get rid of. Variability is intrinsic to the system. It is real. And in fact, it is the most important thing about these systems. What that completely does is the sort of reductive approach to science, saying, well, okay, now we've just spent the last 10 years with functional brain imaging, where any given pixel on the screen there corresponds to 100 million neurons activity. And whoa, we just got a better fMRI machine. Now every pixel will correspond to 10 million neurons. So let's redo all the experiments because there will be less noise now in the measurements. Because hooray, thanks to better measurement tools, we're getting rid of that noisy variability and getting closer to being able to see what's actually going on. And what chaos tells you is, insofar as variability is not noise, it is intrinsic to systems, and in fact what defines them, it doesn't matter how big of a magnifying glass you look at it with, there's still going to be the same amount of variability. Variability is not something to be gotten rid of by getting better gizmos to look at stuff with. It is always going to be there at whatever scale you are looking at. I saw a great example of this about 25 years ago. I had a undergrad hanging out with me who had to have been one of the most diligently obsessive humans on Earth, and we came up with an idea for a study, which was to test this notion. Let's look at some topic, and a reductive sort of mindset tells you the more closely you look at some biological phenomenon, the more you're looking at the little pieces, the more accurate your answers should be, the less variability there should be in the results. And we just, picked out of a hat, let's look at the effects of testosterone on aggression. So he and I went back and we looked at every paper published 10 years earlier on the subject of testosterone and aggression, and we were able to classify it, what level, big sociological level, testosterone levels in this type of culture versus that, and does that tell us anything about aggression? The subject on the level of an individual organism, what does testosterone levels in somebody's bloodstream predict about aggression? At the level of a particular organ, what does levels of glucose consumption by the brain under different testosterone levels? Then on the cellular level, what is testosterone doing to this neuron that's relevant to aggression? Biochemical level, testosterone interacting with this receptor, molecular stuff, X-ray crystallography of like studies of the conformation of testosterone receptors and how it bound to that. And we went through every study published that year, and there were a huge number of them, and classified them. Is this on the subcellular level, cellular, organism, or societal level. And we then looked at all of these studies. By we, I mean he did, because he was incredibly careful and obsessive. And what he did was look at every single data point provided in every one of these papers to measure how much variability there was in the results being presented. If you care about like statistics and stuff, what he was doing was calculating the coefficient of variation for every single mean, seeing how variable were the data being presented in this paper. And the reductive approach generated a very, very simple prediction, which is when you looked at the findings coming from like the societal level, different cultures and different diets produce different testosterone levels and different levels of, when you look at those data, they should be really noisy and variable. And you get somewhat cleaner stuff when you look at whole organisms, and even cleaner at a single organ, single cell, subcellular. As you get more reductive, thank God you've got better measurement tools and that noisy variability is being tossed out. That's exactly the prediction you would get from a reductive mindset, which is, whoa, what a terrific advance. We've stopped being sociologists and instead we're molecular biologists. We've got much better, more reliable tools. And the answer was the level of variability was basically constant, going from the societal level all the way down there. The closer you looked, you were looking, instead of with a questionnaire, you were using binoculars. Instead of binoculars, you were using, an atom smasher. As you got more reductive and more refined, there was the same amount of variability. The variability wasn't noise that you needed to get rid of, noise as the nightmare of every reductive scientist. It was implicit to the system at every single one of those levels. People who are familiar with this sort of literature will know what I'm kind of saying between the lines is that there's a fractal scale-free quality to the amount of variability. So that was really interesting. What was really interesting was when we then tried to go and publish it. So we wrote this up and we sent this to an endocrine journal, and the editor wrote back and said, wow, this is such a fascinating study. I've no idea what it has to do with our field, though, so unfortunately we can't publish it. So they said, oh, well, and we sent it off to a neuro journal, and the editor said, whoa, what a fantastic study. I have no idea what it has to do with my discipline. We sent it to a behavior journal, an evolution journal, and they all come back. And finally, I found this journal called, oh, what is it? Essays in biology and medicine or something like that, where we sent it to them and they said, oh, it's wonderful, we'll publish it. And eventually I figure out I was like the first person under age 90 to ever publish in that journal. And it got published, and now all these years later, it is like beyond ignored. I think it's been cited twice, and both of those were mistaken citations. Like nobody read it. Nobody paid any attention. Actually, there was this one Russian mathematician during the 2000s who found a paper and got totally obsessed with it and was writing to me like virtually weekly about it. And his English was not great, so I was never quite sure either he wanted to adopt me or he wanted me to adopt him. That wasn't completely clear. But other than that, completely ignored, because this is how things work, and variability is built on a reductive world of variability you want to get rid of. And what is implicit in that, most importantly, at the bottom of the whole pile there, is that there are some things that are intrinsically unpredictable. Unpredictable not because you need a better next generation magnifying glass, but because there is intrinsic unpredictability in systems. What we now transition to is the other domain that, in my view, has blown apart reductionism. And this is this whole field of emergence. Emergence has a very, very simple way of thinking about stuff, which is more is different. You want to summarize all of thinking about emergence, and it is in the notion of more is different. And this was said by Philip Anderson, Nobel Prize winning physicist, when his Nobel address said that when you got lots of things put together, when you have lots and lots of players in something, when you have lots of component parts, things happen that you could never ever have predicted from studying the individual pieces. More is different. Or stated a different way, apparently a way that Frederick Engels quoted a number of times, is with enough quantity, you invent a different quality. This is the entire approach of emergence. The notion that more is different. What are we talking about? This is a science of how when you have large numbers of component parts, stuff pops out that you could never have predicted. And stuff pops out where when you look at how it happened, the pieces of what pops out put themselves together. The system self-organizes. This is the key notion with emergence, that you get enough component parts and out of it emerges something that self-organizes into something complicated and ornate and adaptive and all this great stuff that you could never ever have predicted from looking at the building blocks underneath. Because as the other rule of it, the building blocks are idiotic and simplistic and all of that. Here's the way, here's the version that summarizes everything about emergence. You take one ant and you put it on the table and it wanders around making no sense at all. Like random. You put 2 ants, you put 10 ants, they're all wandering around randomly. You put 100 ants, I don't know, they start like they find there's a breadcrumb and they make a line to it or something. You put 10,000 ants together and they form the society that does like amazing architecture and nests, ant tunnels and stuff that are ventilated, and they farm mushrooms underground, and they have different caste systems and this incredibly complicated society. And the whole thing is every single ant is still just as incoherent and simplistic when you put it on its own. It has not gotten any smarter when there's 10,000 of them, but when there's 10,000, stuff emerges. Because more is different, you get qualities where you get self-organization into an ant society. That is the perfect example. The next feature of emergent systems is once something has emerged on this macro level, the only way to describe it is on the macro level. You cannot figure out what it was going to be simply by describing the component parts. As stated, this developmental biologist Paul Weiss once stated it in the context of brain development, like you can start off with the simple component parts. You can start off knowing the rules, but you never get an itinerary. It never tells you what it's going to be like at the end of the road, because the road is being constructed while you were traveling on it. Because the road is being constructed in a way that's a function of how you were traveling on it. And thus there are emergent properties at this self-organizing level that could only be described, only understood at the emergent level. Here's the other cliche of the field. Here's a great example of it. A single molecule of water, H2O, a single molecule of water cannot possess the property of wetness. One molecule of water cannot be wet. Wetness is an emergent property of lots and lots and lots of molecules of water. And the key thing is that water suddenly doesn't start feeling wet, because magically when you put enough of them together, all of a sudden instead of water being H2O, it's suddenly O2H, and that's where wetness comes from. No, nothing about the fact there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen that can predict what wetness is going to feel like. And nothing about it is going to predict that a waterfall basically always looks the same, despite the fact that no molecule of water in it that goes over the edge is ever going to do that again. This system is robust, it's resilient, it's self-correcting, and All of that is happening at a level where ants are still as stupid as they used to be, and water is still made of H2O, and outcome properties that can only be understood at this emergent level. Now, what we'll see for my money, the most interesting aspects of emergent systems is not only is there no itinerary, and not only do the component parts not get smarter, and not all of that, but you'll see over and over self-organization into complex adaptive whatevers without anyone in charge, without anyone in a position of looking at the various bits of knowledge available and making a decision as to what's the best choice to take. It just emerges on its own. And what we'll be looking at is what that looks like in ethological context, in the neurobiological context, all of that. And lurking beneath the surface there, implicit in all of that, is if there's no decider and you don't need to give an itinerary at the beginning because the road doesn't even exist yet, there's no blueprint. There's just some simple starting instructions, but there is no blueprint. And as I say for the first time here, the remarkable subtlety, what that also implies is if there's no blueprints, you don't need to hypothesize a blueprint maker. But we will get back to that. Okay, so what does this sort of emergent, robust stuff look like? Paul Green was a plant developmental biologist, and he was like the weirdest guy on earth. We would have like our annual faculty retreat, which is sort of show and tell what I did this summer. Each person gets up and they talk for 10 minutes and say, well, this past year my lab cloned this and we sequenced that and we did all of that, and here's the structure of this gene, and here's how many exons and introns it is, and go through that. And everyone, you clap a little bit, and then you go get a Danish or something, and you hear the next person. And then Paul Green would get up, and he would say something like, well, last year, my group was thinking, how many rules does a monocot leaf need in order to look like a monocot leaf? And we think it only needs 3 rules. And then he would sit down, and everyone would say, what the? And like, this was just so bizarre. What? He didn't clone anything? He didn't sequence something? He didn't measure the binding affinity of some plant hormone for its receptor? How many rules does it take for this type of leaf to look this way? And we think there's only 3 rules. That's what he was doing. So he would give this wonderful lecture, whose math I understood absolutely zero. He would talk about some sort of physical pressure physics sort of thing. Suppose you've got a disk, and Paul Green would then take you to, so let's do an experiment with it. What if you heat the system? And it would take you through these unbelievably complicated equations that would promptly lose me about how heat playing out on this material versus along the edge would work out differently. And then he would do this incredible sort of tour de force math thing and show at the end that the only mathematical solution is something that looks not at all like this. The only mathematical solution is that this thing reaches its lowest energy confidence. It forms a double saddle. And, well, that's great. Who knows where the math came from, but okay, that's how it resolves that. And then he would show us a potato chip. And the only mathematical solution for how this slice of potato is going to deal with this thermal challenge is to buckle into a double saddle thing, and then you put it in your can of Pringles and it fits right in there, and whoa, that's totally cool. Let's tell you, how in hell did that slice of potato know how to form a double saddle? Was it genetic instructions? No, there's like no genes, and it's a slice of potato, and it just happens because this is how the physics of it play out. And the only way you could heat a slice of potato and get an outcome, the only thing it will look like at the end is a double saddle, like a potato chip. How do you wire up things as efficiently as possible without a blueprint and without a central authority? So first example of this, how do bees figure out when it's time for them to move their colony, their beehive, to a new location, how do they do it? As follows. So here's the hive, and you send out 2 scouts. And one of them finds a possible location this far away, and the other one finds a possible location twice as far away. What do they do at that point? They do our ethology, Carl von Frisch deal. They come back to the hive and they start dancing. And they dance as to, where is this source? How far you go in this direction, go at this angle. It's this wonderful of a new potential home, and this is an equally wonderful potential. And look at something that happens here. The way it works now is we are relying upon random interactions, which is this bee comes back and dancing around the hive there, and all the other bees in there are just wandering around in random frenzy. And the rule is, if they bump into this dancing bee, they decipher what she is saying, and they fly out to the same place. Thus, random movement of first generation of scouts, and the second generation that randomly bumps into what this particular scout was doing and gets recruited into giving the same message as this scout. So let's play this out, because this is twice as far from the hive as this one. It takes twice as long for this to do a going out, checking out the place, and coming back and broadcasting it as this one. So let's go through different. At time A, this individual has already gotten back to the hive. This one is not yet back. Time B, as a result of this one dancing, it has now recruited another bee. This one has just gotten back and started dancing. At this point, we're now up to 4 bees here, because this one takes twice as long to get to. It hasn't recruited the second one yet. And so on. And what you soon get is 99% of the hive settles on the right solution, which is go to the place that's closer. And nobody had any knowledge of both of these locations. All that happened is, because of this pattern here, because of these interactions, out emerged the optimal solution, and the whole beehive picks up and flies away. Next version of it, of how bees find a great new place. This time, the 2 potential sources are equally distant, but this one is twice as good as this one. And you have to get a means of linking that as follows. The better the source that you have found, the louder you broadcast that information. What do we mean in the case of bees? Bees come back from finding something, they come in and they dance, and they stop after a while because they get tired or bored. And the deal is, if this site is twice as good by whatever criteria as this site, this bee, when she comes back, is going to dance for twice as long. And as a result of that, there's twice the likelihood of some random other bee bumping into her and getting recruited. And thus there's now 2 of them that are dancing longer and that much more likely to get, simply because they broadcast the signal for a longer time. They recruit more individuals who recruit more individuals, and then before you know it, you have solved the exact same thing, and the entire colony goes to the preferable site. Nobody had any knowledge of both of these sites. There was no blueprint, there was no decider, there was no master plan, there was no itinerary beforehand saying, you know, you're going to wind up here at the end. It simply emerged as a function of, you broadcast a better signal, louder, longer, more intensely, whatever. And when you have enough component parts working that way, you will emerge, you will self-organize with an optimal solution. So that's how bees do it. Ants. Let's look at ants now. So ants have a similar sort of problem, which is they want life to be easy and successful and leave on copies of their genes. So you got ants, and suppose there's 6 different places outside their ant home where there's a food source. There's 6 different potential foraging sites, and ant scouts, note again this notion, a first generation of scouts, ant scouts go out there and they explore these different foraging sites. And what they want to do is not only find the good ones, but they want to find the shortest path connecting all of these. Because ants have little legs, there are actually entomologists who study like how much energy it takes for an ant to walk this many inches in the Amazon versus the Gobi Desert. And you've got 6 different possible foraging sites. And there's a gazillion different paths that an ant can take to visit each one of them and see what's available today. And that little ant who doesn't want to waste energy by returning to any place more than once. And there are a huge number of ways, in this case, 5 factorial, which is 14. There's 14 different ways, routes that an ant could take to visit each site without repeating their 14. So we get to 10 foraging sites and we're up to, I don't know, 100 million. We get to 15 and we're at 100 billion or something. We have what is called a version of the traveling salesman problem, which has been vexing mathematicians for centuries, which is here's a number of possible sites and you want to go to each one only once, but go to each one of them. How do you figure out the shortest path to do that with? And centuries into the traveling salesman problem, there is no standard solution to it. And one solution is you just brute force it. You get some computer that just like churns out every single one of the 100 billion possibilities and tells you, oh, this is the best one. This is not a subtle solution. If you want to get close to the optimal solution to this traveling salesman problem, what you do is you ask ants to solve it for you. And they do it in a way that is now referred to as swarm intelligence. With virtual ants, a lot of companies now use when programming, trying to solve optimization patterns like this. Here's what the rule is. You get a first generation of ants who go out and just explore all these different sites. And the deal is that as they go from one site to another, they leave a pheromone trail. Their butts has some pheromone gland and they lean it down and run along the ground there. So they are leaving a trail of all the places they've gone to. So this is your pioneer generation. Now we need to do an equivalent to, if it's a better source, you dance longer, a way by which a good route is broadcast more loudly than a lesser route. And how is that done? The shorter the path between 2 points, the thicker the pheromone trail is that the ant leaves, which makes perfect sense. If you are leaving a pheromone trail going from here to here versus from here to here, because this is half the distance, you can put out 2 times as much pheromones with each step is going to be twice as thick as this one. Better, shorter routes have thicker pheromone trails. And now this has to translate into a time element, just like here. The thicker the pheromone trail, the longer it takes for it to evaporate. So now you let loose your second generation of ants, and these are the ones who wander randomly. Just like the bees randomly bumping into one of the dancers and being recruited, now you let a gazillion ants just go over this area, and their only rule is if you bump into a pheromone trail, you join it. And you add your pheromones to it. And what we've now seen is, as time goes by, you're more likely to bump into one of the better, shorter routes than the longer ones, because the longer ones have been evaporating because they have less pheromone per unit grounder. You bump into it, and this is one that has lasted longer, and as a result, you make it last even longer by adding your pheromones to it. Makes that much more likely that someone else, and you run enough rounds of this, and out emerges the optimal solution. or as shown with ads, typically 99% of the way to the optimal solution. They solved the traveling salesman problem here with these simple rules, a pioneer generation that broadcasts what they find out as a function of how great the news is, a random wandering population, which is set up in a rich get richer scheme to reinforce the better routes and add their voice to it. And out of this, ants come up with this in a fraction of the time that your computer would. And once again, there's no blueprint and there's no blueprint maker. It just emerges. And this is, again, sufficiently the case that, like telecommunication companies that are trying to wire up a whole bunch of radio towers and radio, they have to have cables. They want to minimize the amount of money they have to spend on cables. What's the most optimal way to do this? And they run virtual ads doing virtual swarm intelligence to solve it for them. So we've now just seen a first pass of what emergence looks like. What we will pick up on Friday is how the same thing then plays out the same exact rules when slime molds learn how to solve mazes. And then most remarkably, we'll see how the brain does the exact same thing. Pioneer generation that broadcasts louder for better findings, random wanderers which reinforce the good messages for how your cortex wires up. And this is just the first step at seeing it's the same rules. Arcade, now that the animals are baying, it's the end of class, so we will pick up on this on Friday.